So, welcome everybody to my talk about Conway's Law and why I'm tired of it. Let me say a few words about myself. So, my name is Eberhard Wolff. I'm with INNOQ. We are a consulting company here in Germany. We mostly do software development projects. I do a lot of consulting and training. And I actually wrote a few books. So I wrote a few books about microservices. I wrote a book about continuous delivery, and I'm happy to be here. So thanks for taking the time. I will also make sure to answer any questions that you might have. So feel free to put them in the Q&A and in the chat. I might not be able to answer them live here in the stream, but I will definitely do so in the chat and in Hopin. So. Why this talk? I mean, Conway's law is important, that's for sure, but I think there are far too many simplifications and misunderstandings. So this is why I thought it would make some sense to have a presentation that talks about my view on Conway's law and about those misunderstandings. And before I start, let me ask you a question that you might want to think about. So let's imagine that there is a project manager and she defines the architecture. So do you think that's a good idea? Usually I get a huge majority that says, no, it's not a good idea. But we'll come back to that later. So let's talk about Conway's law first. And I'm sort of sorry because I'm tired of Conway's law, but I do have to talk about it. So I have to define it and say what it's all about. So this is the person who actually sort of came up with it. It's Mel Conway. He is still on Twitter. Twitter is what we used to use before there was Mastodon around. And he wrote this famous paper that is called How Do Committees Invent? And that's the paper that talks about Conway's law and what it actually means. So what is it? Well, in one slide, it basically says that the architecture copies the communication structures of the organization that develops the software. And that's already the first sort of misunderstanding. So the first misunderstanding is that this law talks about the organization that builds the system. So it's about the teams that develop the software. It's not any other organization. So it's not about users or customers. So the departments in your business, in your company that you develop the software for, that is not what will be reflected in the software. It's rather the organizational structures of the organization that develops the software. That's quite different. So how can you think about it? Well, let's imagine that we develop some software and there are a few teams. So here is one team and here is another team. And they have some goals. So this team has to do something and that team has to do something. Chances are that they need to communicate with one another to somehow achieve that goal. Because usually at the end of the day, the whole system will be a collaboration of all these teams, and therefore they have to communicate with one another. And then there is yet another team, and again, they have to talk to that team too. And once you do that, this is basically what Conway's law states, you will come up with modules. So each of these modules has some interface, and this is what those persons that develop those modules will actually talk about. So there will be a dependency here, and there will be some kind of, well, interface usually, and this is how it works. So basically, if you want to make it, sort of sum it up in just 2 words, it's basically the communication that drives the architecture, and this is what it's all about. Okay, now I was talking about modules, and modules are fundamental to software architecture, so I want to spend a few slides on modules, on what they actually are. So what are modules and why would I even care? Well, modules are there to limit knowledge. That's the intention. And typically a module is, well, basically a box, right? This is why lots of developers, draw boxes, diagrams. So we have one of those, and then we have quite a few. We have a few additional modules, and now we can change the system by understanding a single module in detail. So there would be one person or a team that would understand this module, and this is basically all they need to understand to change anything in that system. And that's a huge advantage because it means that they don't need to understand this, this, and this, and therefore we can build systems that are too complex to understand for one human, and this is actually the main challenge that we have in software development. So this is one thing. The other thing is that we can also reason about the collaboration of those modules. This is usually what architecture is about, and this is only possible because we can abstract away from the fact that how the modules work internally. Ideally, we should have loose coupling. So those modules do have dependency. There is no such thing as an independent module because at the end of the day, the modules will form a whole. They are part of a whole system. But the idea is to have loose coupling. So changes to one module should have little effect on the other ones. So here, this change, this yellow circle that I have, this is actually limited to one module. And this change, well, it is not just this module, but in fact, there is a small impact on this one as well, and there is a small impact on that one as well. And this is, of course, not too nice because it means that we now have to somehow make sure that all of these three modules are understood and changed. But at the end of the day, this is something that will probably happen because there are dependencies. The point is here that there should be loose coupling, which means the main module that should be affected by changes should be this one, for example, and it should have little impact on the other ones. So that's basically the main point. So why would we do that? Well, to limit knowledge on modules and to make software therefore easier to understand and therefore changeable. So at the end of the day, this is about humans, right? This is why we are doing that. We do that because we are humans and we can't fully understand all of the system. So that's the main point, that the main reason why we are doing this. What else is there? Well, there is a dependency between Conway's law and modularization. So we have a team here and a module, and they know the implementation, and the other teams would only know the interface and would communicate with those other systems via the interface. And here is the other team, and again they have less communication, so they only know the interface, and that's it. Which in a sense already means that in order to do anything sensible, we do have to collaborate, because this is the team that actually knows how to change that module, and the other teams don't know how to do that, and that's intentional. So we need to have a collaboration between these three teams. So at the end of the day, if we don't have any collaboration, then it won't work. And this is something that is also described in one of the old fundamental papers of software architecture that was written by Parnas. And this basically says that in order to design a system, you have to think about how much information is spread throughout the system to the other developers, to the other teams. And you can find that paper online. And also my former colleague, Adrian Collier, he wrote a blog post about this paper and how that paper and how that paper also impacts microservices, for example. And he actually got Parnas himself to comment on that blog. So that was great. So let me talk about something that is sort of motivated by a consulting gig that I did. And in that consulting gig, we had one scenario in which a project manager decided that three teams should work on one module. And now the question obviously is that a good idea? So you can think for yourself whether it's a good idea or not. And I would argue it's a bad idea because as I said, modules are meant to limit knowledge. That's the idea. So multiple teams working on a single module means that all of them have to understand that one module. And it's also that the changes will influence the other teams. So it means that if one team does a change to the module that everyone works on, they actually have to closely coordinate with the other teams, and this might lead to a lot of overhead and a lot of coordination, and that is why we should probably distribute modules across teams. So that's basically the point. So any problem, any loophole, anything that I didn't think about? Well, actually, if you look at it, this is Conway's law, right? Architecture copies the communication structure of the organization, and this has some impact. So if the project manager decides that 3 teams should work on one module, actually it violates Conway's law. So that's not going to work out. We can have 3 teams working on 3 modules. This is what Conway's law states. This is one possible outcome of the whole thing. Or we can have 1 team working on 1 module, but we can't have 3 teams working on 1 module. So this is basically sort of a violation of Conway's law. And Conway's law is more like gravity, right? Just because I don't believe in gravity doesn't mean that I can fly. So just because I don't believe in Conway's law doesn't mean that it's not applicable. It's sort of something that will just happen. And because this decision violates Conway's law, we will have a different outcome. We won't have 3 teams working on 1 module. We will probably have 3 teams working on 3 modules, or 1 team working on 1 module, and this is how it's going to end up. Assuming that those teams would closely communicate with one another. That's another point that we will talk about later on. So actually, if someone decides that 3 teams should work on 1 module, it doesn't really work that way. And I have to admit that I'm not entirely sure what would happen if you do that. And chances are that, well, as I said, maybe the team will collaborate so closely that it really becomes 1 team, or maybe the 3 teams will somehow figure out that the module that they should work on is really separatable into 3 modules, and then they will do that, and we'll see what happens. So there is a question here, and this is something that I had to think about when I was at that consulting gig. So let's imagine that this actually happens. So project manager decides that 3 teams should work on 1 module. So the question becomes, what shall we do as architects? I would argue that we should collaborate with the project manager, because they might not understand Conway's law, which is perfectly fine because it's a law in the software architecture domain, and as a project manager you probably don't really understand that, and you don't know that, and I'm pretty sure that there is a lot of stuff about project management that I don't understand as a technical person or as an architect. So it's fine to have that problem that you don't really understand that. Probably they have some reason to act like that. So even if you know that something will happen, and probably there will be, it will be hard for those teams to really work in the way that it's intended, there might still be a reason, because maybe you really need to do that. Really need to hit that deadline, and adding more people to that problem is the only option that you have. And maybe the only way, and is also a way to say, well, actually, we tried our very best and we still failed. So usually teams and projects win or lose as one. So there is no such thing as one person wins in that overall team, because if you have a failure, it's everyone. And the assumption is that the project manager, as well as we as technical people, actually should collaborate because we have a common goal. So therefore, collaboration makes a lot of sense. And it's quite, I would argue it's quite unlikely that the project manager intentionally does something stupid to bring the project into, well, complicated times and to pose some challenges for the project. I think that's not what's going to happen. So my advice would be to drink some coffee or tea with those persons, understand what actually their intention is, and to provide feedback. I think there is a generally, as architects, one of the things that we have to do, which is very important, is to provide feedback to everyone around, because we do have a technical expertise, and we need to make that technical expertise usable for other people too. So we also need to talk to other people, and we need to figure out what really happens with the architecture and the three teams. Because of Conway's law, I would assume that the decision, once you actually make it, it leads to, well, some result, but it's maybe not the result that you originally intended. So much for modules and Conway's law. Actually, Conway's law became somewhat more famous in the last few years, I would say, because of the inverse Conway maneuver. And the inverse Conway maneuver is something that belongs to the set of architecture patterns that we have in the microservices environment. Originally it was, I think, James Lewis who came up with the idea. And basically the idea is to have the architecture drive the organization. So we set up the organization in a way, in some specific way, and then the architecture will follow. That's the idea. And it's inverse Conway because you're not accepting the organization as something that influences the architecture, but it's quite the other way around. So you set up the organization in a way that it reflects the architecture, and maybe you don't even, well, because Conway's law is applicable, you just set up the organization, and then the architecture will naturally follow. So that's sort of the idea. So let me walk you through an example. So let's imagine that we have a set of people, developers, designers, and whatever. And obviously, what we see here is chaos, right? Lots of different people, and they all have their own opinion. So we now introduce some order into that chaos, and we introduce even more order in that chaos. And now we assign specific tasks to these teams. So we have one team for order process, we have another team for delivery, and we have a third team for invoicing. And therefore, we set up the whole environment in a way that it now will create 3 modules, and this is what's going to happen. There is no other way out of this. And as you saw in those slides, right, I think this is a simplification. This is why intentionally I started with that chaos and all these different people, because I sort of think that what inverse Conway does is it tries to change the organizational chart, right? So it basically says, here are 3 teams, this is how it works. And the org chart is not communication. Now you could argue, well, this is just a minor detail, right? When you set up the org chart in a specific way, of course people will communicate in the way intended by the org chart. So what is your point? But this is the fundamental assumption, right? That the org chart will directly influence how people work on modules and on communication. And I'm actually not sure whether it works that way. And this is because there are cases where, there is extreme cases. That's like the most extreme case that I could think of, where you would have an organization and you would do a reorganization to that organization, and people would just say, well, this is just another reorganization. We have 2 or 3 of those every year, and nothing really changed. So I'll just stay here at my desk, and I don't care what the org chart says. I'll just keep on doing what needs to be done, and this doesn't really influence me. That's the most extreme case. So in that case, you would change the org chart, and the result would be nothing. The other thing is that there are other ways to influence communication. So if you have different people from different teams sitting in one room, so they report into different team organizations, and they have stand-ups with different teams, but they sit in one room, chances are that they will talk to one another, and this will strengthen collaboration, communication, and therefore will have an impact on the software architecture. And I think this is actually great news, because it means by changing something apart from the org chart, you can actually influence architecture and communication. So I think the other problem, it's not just that I think the inverse Conway is too simple because the relation between the org chart and the communication is not that obvious. I also think that it sort of limits us from taking other measures to improve communication and collaboration or change collaboration and communication and therefore change the architecture, because usually architects don't really get to decide the org chart, right? And I like the term irritating the organization. So that's a term that seems to come from sociology. I spoke with my colleague Gerrit Beine, who is studying sociology and is also consulting with INNOQ. And I learned this term. Sorry. I learned this term irritation. And the new org chart is such an irritation. So basically, you're irritating the organization, and the organization will somehow react to that irritation. And that's not really deterministic. So it can lead to the intended new communication structure. So it therefore can lead to different modules, but it could also be completely ignored. So the way to think about these kinds of things is that you do irritate the organization, but the organization will somehow react to that. And as I said, the most extreme case would be that it's just being ignored or fighted against, and these kinds of things. So inverse Conway has, as I said, a few assumptions. So it assumes that people follow the organization chart, people communicate according to that org chart, and I think that's too simplistic. And therefore, well, there is a question here, right? And the question is organization really a tool for architecture? And I used to do talks that argued exactly that argued, well, if you have the organization, if you can change it, then this is a perfect tool for architecture. So the question becomes, should architects define the organization? Well, I mean, it might not help that much anyways, but it is still something, in our tool belt, it might be something that we might want to add to our tool belt. Well, let's imagine that we are a project manager, and now there is some architect, and they decide who does what. Now the question is that a good idea? Because that's at the core what this inverse Conway maneuver says. It says, as an architect, I get to decide who does what in our project, because it's about team setup. And this is why I asked that question at the very beginning. So as architects, we don't really like project managers to decide the architecture. I would certainly welcome feedback from them, but if they get to decide the architecture, this is just, in my opinion, wrong. And if you agree to that, then as an architect, you should not decide about the organization, because this is core to what project managers do. So there are deadlines, budgets, these kinds of things, and to deal with them, to deal with the budget, to deal with the deadline, the tool that you have is, how do you set up the teams? How do you make that work? And therefore, this is one of the most important tools that you have. And you can't, in my opinion, you can't really have someone else decide about that. Of course, there should be feedback. As I said, there is sort of this is what we need to do all the time, provide feedback to all those roles and give them some idea about the architecture impact and the technical impact. But to have the architects decide about the organization, in my opinion, is just plain wrong. So, as I said, who does what depends on deadlines, budgets, organizational constraints. And me, at least, I want to do architecture And I have to admit that I happily leave those issues to project managers because my day is already filled up with doing architecture, which I actually enjoy. And therefore, project managers need to be empowered to decide who does what. And it's not something that architects should take over. So at the end of the day, it's about collaboration again. So architects should support project managers. We do have common goals. Architects should not control project managers. This is something that some people came up with as an idea that, if a project manager decides that 3 teams should work on one module, then the architect should be able to override that decision. And I think that makes little sense, because if there is a deadline and if there are good reasons for the project manager to do that, then they should be able to do it. And it doesn't make a lot of sense to override that decision and take over responsibility for a potential failure of the whole project. Project managers should therefore, as I said, support architects. So it's both ways. It's not just one supporting the other, but it's supporting each other basically. And providing feedback, again, as I said, I think architecture is yet another constraint for the organization, right? There are constraints like budget, like deadlines, and what have you. So therefore, you can provide some feedback and make that constraint more visible. But really deciding about it, I think, doesn't make a lot of sense. So there we go again. Here is another reason why you want to have some coffee and some tea with each other, and why you want to talk to project managers, provide feedbacks, talk to all the other people. And as I said, communication, not organization, strengthens the architecture, and I think everyone can actually work on that. So let me talk about another thing where architecture and organization actually have sort of, a relation to one another, and that's strategic domain-driven design. Strategic domain-driven design is concerned with bounded context, and for this talk, I will just say that a bounded context is basically a special module. It's a specific part of the system. I could talk about that for an hour, but for what I'm going to discuss here, this very simplified understanding is actually enough. And usually such bounded contexts are handled by one team, and there would be something that matters to the business, so an order process, delivery process, these kinds of things. Now, strategic domain-driven design says that a part of the system might be more or less important. And also, a team might need support from other teams to be successful. So I need to have some help from other teams, and therefore I need there are some patterns for collaboration between teams. So let me give you an example. So let's imagine that we have an e-commerce system, and in the e-commerce system there is the shipping, and the shipping is actually quite important because this is how we are unique, how we are competing against other companies in our environment, because we are much more reliable, much faster, much more flexible in how we ship stuff to the customer. Now, obviously, if I need to develop this piece of software, I need to have some support from whoever does the order processing and accepts the orders, because they will provide me the information about these orders. And if I don't have the correct information about these orders, then I can't ship them. So therefore, there needs to be some support. And obviously, in my opinion, really obviously, the way to do that is by telling one team to support the other one. And this is something that it says in the original blue book by Eric Evans about domain-driven design. I think it appears very logical to me that this is how things should be done, right? I don't see like a good alternative, and I do believe that this is the way how things should actually work ideally. But the problem is that I see little adoption of these of these strategic domain-driven design patterns. So let's talk about one of them. So one of them is customer supplier. And in customer supplier, there is first of all the downstream and the upstream teams. So the downstream team, in our example, it might be shipping, or the delivery process, depends on order process to be successful. And that is because if you don't get the correct information about the order, there is no way that you can deliver the stuff to the customer. So for that reason, you do need to have that support. You're dependent. And what customer supplier now says is that the downstream priorities, so the priorities of the delivery process team, should be factored into the planning of the upstream team of the supplier, which is the order processing team. And you would then negotiate and budget tasks. So basically, what this means is that the delivery process team could go to the order process team and say, well, we really need you to get that information about the order to us. Please do that. And then the order process team would say, well, that's actually not that hard to do, but we have other stuff for the next sprint, so let's do it in the sprint after that. Is that fine? Yeah, it's fine. So then there are other sources of stories and features, and therefore the customer cannot just dictate what is done at the supplier, but really there should be some compromise. So we have two teams here, and the customer would give some priorities to that other team, which becomes the supplier. So delivery would give those priorities to order, and then we would have a negotiation about budget and tasks. And the question here really is, can you as a person decide to set up a customer-supplier relationship? So I'm looking for reasons why I don't really see a lot of adoption of these patterns. And obviously one of the reasons why the adoption of this pattern might not be that huge is, well, if you can't really implement it, if you can't really decide about a customer-supplier relation, then there is just no way that you can implement the pattern. So let's see. Customer supplier is about who does what, right? It's about telling the order processing team that the delivery team is one source of requirements and stories. And this is probably not what an architect decides. Typically, I would assume that this is something that a project manager decides, and for very good reasons, right? This is the discussion that we had beforehand. They are responsible for deadlines, they are responsible for budgets and so on, and I don't, that's what they do, and I don't want to do it. So it's perfectly fine for them to do it. Now, what this basically means is we have those two teams here, and we rely on the project manager and their magic wand to declare one of the teams a customer and declare the other team a supplier, and then you're done. Now, let me tell you what could happen if you actually do that. So, this team now is the customer and tells the supplier that they need that feature as soon as possible. So we are doing what the pattern says, right? We are having a negotiation about budgets and tasks and deadlines and these kinds of things between those two teams. Now that team says, well, it's going to take 3 months and we can't start until in 6 months. Okay, so the customer says, well, it really looks to me as if this should only take a few days. And the supplier says, well, it takes 3 months and we can't really start until in 6 months. So the customer says, okay, we are going to escalate because there is that person, the project manager, who originally set up that relation, and we don't believe that this relation is actually, well, really working. And the supplier still says, well, it's going to take 3 months and we can't start until in 6 months. And the project manager says, okay, there is really little I can do. So at the end of the day, it leaves the customer frustrated. I presented that at one point, and we had actually quite a lot of discussion about how this team has the assumption that it's going to be a lot quicker than what this team says, and that's actually a very good point, because as an external team, you can't really tell how much effort there will be. So actually, this might just be bad, tough luck for the customer and a misunderstanding of the customer. But really, what I wanted to say with this slide is that this pattern relies on the supplier and the customer to collaborate. And there are ways, and we all know, we probably do know those ways, how we can fight those relations. And one of them is to say, well, it's just going to be very, very hard to do that. So I really would love to do it, but it's not gonna, I just can't do it. So therefore, the customer supplier role, the managers could set up such a customer supplier relationship, but in real life, we all know how this can be circumvented or fighted against. And there is a different scenario. So let's imagine that there is some random person in this team, and they meet some other person from that other team at the coffee machine, and they are having a coffee together, and it seems that they had an enjoyable bike ride at the weekend, so they seem to know each other very well, and that was really an enjoyable bike ride. And now that person says, okay, I really need to get some help from you or from your team, because you really need to support us with implementing that feature. And they actually got what they needed. And in this case, there was no relationship explicitly set up, but it still works. And again, I think we all know that we can do these things, and we actually do them. It's just that I'm not sure that we are actually aware of them. So even if you don't have a formal control over a team, you can still try to influence it. And therefore, a customer supplier is a domain-driven design pattern that you cannot just implement. There is no way, there are domain-driven design patterns, in particular on the code level, that you could do, that you can implement. But this is, I think, different. And project managers might decide differently for some reason. So again, it's about drinking coffee and tea. So it's about, it's not about what an architect usually decides. It's more about, providing feedback and understanding how other people are setting up the organization, and use informal ways. So here's my conclusion. Conway's law basically says that the communication leads to the architecture, and the modules, the whole thing, the reason why we are doing modules, why we are doing software architecture, is because we want to control the flow of information through the organization. That's information hiding. And Conway's law basically says that 3 teams cannot work on one module. That's just not possible. They will probably build separate modules. And inverse Conway, again, is too simplistic. It sort of irritates the organization, but there is no guaranteed output. And architects should not try to decide the organization all by themselves. That's just not something that's going to work, and for good reasons, and you shouldn't do it. So therefore, architects cannot implement customer supplier all by themselves. So my advice would be, try to better understand what is going on with the organization, and provide feedback about that, which basically means drink more coffee and tea. I brought a few links with me. I am afraid that they are in German, and I do apologize for that. But still, I thought German links are probably better than nothing. So here is a link to a blog post to a podcast that I actually did with my colleague Gerrit, that talks about organization as a tool for software. On Fridays, I do a stream, and I actually did a few streams about things that are related to what I'm talking about here. So there is one episode about Conway's Law. There is another episode with, again, Garrett. I would rather recommend the podcast, not this episode. This episode is something that we did before the podcast. The podcast is therefore sort of the second better version. And I also did an episode about organization architecture. There are slide sketch notes, as you can see, so there is no need to listen to it or watch it. You can also download it as a podcast, but you can also look at the sketch note as it's done. There is an email address here. If you send an email to that email address, you will get a link to a Dropbox that includes the slides, my free material, which are basically a few booklets about microservices and so on, samples from my books. This is a small Amazon script and a microservice, and the data privacy note is that your email address will be locked for 14 days. That's the minimum that I can set up. And if you misspell the email address, then I will handle those emails manually. I'm really eager to answer some of the questions, and one of the questions by Marcus is, in self-organizing teams, project managers play a very limited role. How can multiple self-organizing teams take advantage of Conway's law to strengthen complex systems architecture? Well, the law still applies, and I do admit that this talk basically says there is a project manager who decides about the organization. And I would argue that there is such a role. Even if you have self-organizing teams, there are people who actually decide about the organization. They might not be called project managers, but someone does it. And the core of what I'm trying to say here is that as an architect, you should influence that. You could influence it, but you shouldn't decide it by yourself. So I don't think that it's very different in self-organizing teams. I think in self-organizing teams, or even if you are if you don't have a project manager and you have some different form of team setup, it's still the sort of same ideas apply. It's just that, provide feedback, try to influence it, but you can't dictate it. I think that's still applicable.
Terrific. Thank you for answering that. We have a couple more questions as well. The next is that, do you think fully remote organizations may face more challenges to implement this strategy? If so, how to minimize it?
Yeah, obviously there are things that you can't do, right? Like putting several people in a room and then relying on them to work more closely together. So maybe therefore the sort of formal relations become more obvious. The other thing, one of the advices that I give is that you should use these informal ways, and there is no coffee machine that you could meet people at, obviously in the remote world. So I think what you need to do is you need to set up those things explicitly. So what I did in one project, and it turned out that this was a very good idea, even so it might even seem ridiculous, we ended up having pizza in front of the computer every Friday. So everyone would order a pizza, and we would just have a Zoom session running, and we would talk to one another. And those turned out to be really productive meetings, and without any agenda. And you could do that with other people too, and set up calls with other people to discuss specific things. And I think that's a good idea. So my advice would be to realize that there are less chances for communication that just pop up, and make sure that they still happen.
I think that's terrific advice, and that's definitely a strategy I've seen work. We have a somewhat long question, but I will just read it here. So you say that an architect doesn't define or set customer-supplier relationship between two teams, but using DDD strategic design, you as an architect are involved by defining the bounded context and context map. It means as architects, we have some influence on defining this kind of relationships, or not?
Yeah, obviously we do. Yes, I would agree that we have influence on setting up the bounded context and sort of doing the architecture part of that game, which is to define, well, the architecture, right? So which piece of code it becomes one bounded context, how are we going to split up a system into bounded context. Now, the problem that I have with domain-driven design, to be perfectly honest, is that it's sort of blurry what a bounded context really is, because if you look at strategic design, all of a sudden a bounded context is almost synonymous for a team. And that's, as I said, something that we don't get to decide. So, as I said in the presentation, and that's probably at the core of the whole problem. And it's interesting because if you think about it, customer supplier at the end of the day, in my opinion, just says that one team gives some task to another team or asks them to do something. And that is something that you can do without having bounded context in the code at all. It's just an organizational pattern. And I would argue that team topologies, for example, expands on that idea and has some different ideas. And therefore, these strategic domain-driven design patterns, to me, are really organizational patterns, and they are, at least customer supplier, to me, is independent from the code. And one of the things that I do in my trainings is I ask people to figure out how they can tell whether customer supply is implemented in the code. And the answer is you can't. I mean, you can't really. Some people try to be smart about it, like try to get that information how the teams collaborate from comments or comments on code commits. But really, the easy way and the obvious way to figure out whether customer supply is implemented is by looking at how those teams collaborate.
Terrific, and I hope that answers the question. We have time for one final question. So this question is, the structure of many software systems is a monolith that evolved into a big ball of mud. Does that tell us something about the organizational structure of the organizations developing those systems, according to Conway's law?
Yeah, that's actually a very good question. And I would tend to think the reason why we end up with such messy architectures is because we let them evolve into that. It becomes messy over time, and therefore I don't think that it's about discipline and about not being relentless if you do changes. I think relentlessness is the number one reason why we end up with those architectures. And then it's the other way around. So once you have a big ball of mud, you're forced into close collaboration because a change might influence random other parts of the system, and it's hard to predict what will change. So therefore, you have to closely collaborate. By the way, one remark. So the original paper, or Conway's original paper, and you have to think about that it's written in 1968, actually argues that if you have a huge project, chances are your communication breaks down, and then your architecture will also break down. So if you ever happen to come across a huge system where the architecture is messy, maybe that's the reason. And I think it's interesting to see that he sort of put out that hypothesis in 1968.
Thank you. Thank you so much for taking the time to answer these questions and for the terrific talk. It's always great to have you at the Software Architecture Gathering.